stuff. Thank you to Tanya and Jennifer. Tanya, I got your email just before I got on. And so when we're finished, hang on at the end and you and I can just have a quick conversation around that, okay? Perfect. So again, for those of you just joining us, we did send materials. They were not sent until quite late, so you only got them in the last 20 minutes or so. So they're in your email if you want to open your email, or shoot them to a printer if you want to take some notes, or reference the materials. We will be kind of filling in a chart on each of the 4 different personality profiles so that you have the data on each of them. So it might be helpful to have that blank document. Alrighty, so it's funny. I'll tell you a quick story before we get started. In the early days of our Zooming experience, so I guess it was like in April or so, I was doing a class or a mastermind or something, and I asked people to turn their cameras on, and there was like very little response. So thank you for those of you who have your cameras on. And I said out loud, after there wasn't really much response and no one was turning cameras on, I said, all right, well, I'm just going to start randomly picking some people and turning their cameras on from here. And 2 people turned their cameras on and said, wait a minute, you can control our camera? And I said, yeah, I'm the host. So I have all of I can mute you, I can unmute you, I can turn your cameras off, I can turn your cameras on. Boy, I let that go on for about 10 minutes. They were so freaked out that I had control over their cameras. It was one of the best Zoom moments of my entire Zoom career, because they were really good. I don't understand. Why is that fair? What if I'm like just getting out of the shower and I have the computer and I'm listening to it and you turn the camera on? Well, I hope you've been working out. That's my thought. And of course, I cannot turn your camera on. I can turn your camera off. Because we have had, over the course of the 5 months, we have had a couple of, let's call them close calls, where people were in the shower or people were not ready for a Zoom camera to be on. So we do have, believe it or not, especially in our large group sessions, we do have people who monitor the screens. And if I'm the host, text me immediately to say, camera off, camera off, camera off, with a name. So fun stuff that you just don't know about what's going on in the Zoom rooms, but that is all real. All right, so let's dive in. Now I've given you enough time to get your documents for the disc. Let's run through quickly what each of these 4 personality profiles looks like, right? And before we do that, let's have this conversation. Is there, when it comes to behavior, right? Because I just said personality profiles, and I really disagree with that. It's not really personality, right? It's behavior. What's the difference between personality and behavior? So behavior, in my opinion, is kind of, it's deep-rooted, it's foundational, right? You are born with certain behavioral traits. Personality can be developed over time, right? Or not developed, or developed in a certain way. It's easier to change a personality, if you so choose, than it is a behavior, right? Behavior is, again, kind of foundational and deep-rooted. And the DISC, the DISC, is an assessment tool that was created by, I think his name is Jim Abelson. And Dr. Abelson kind of realized that most people fall into 4 different categories and named them the D, the I, the S, and the C, which we now know today as the DISC. And so we're going to go through each of those quadrants for the D, the I, the S, and the C. And if you're working off of this document that I sent, you'll see there's 4 quadrants. You've got a box for each, and we'll go through and outline what each of those folks looks like. Give me a second. Oh, I've got something caught in my throat. That's killing me. All right, so let's start with this statement. Let me ask a question first. Is behavior right or wrong? Can you have the right behavior versus the wrong behavior? So the simple answer to that is no, behavior isn't right or wrong. You may have behavioral styles that are more or less compatible with a role that you want to succeed at, or an industry you want to get into. So there's compatibility conversations. However, behavior isn't right or wrong, right? It just kind of is. The only time I would disagree with that statement is if you use natural behavior as some kind of defense or excuse for poor behavior, right? Because those are two different things. I'll give you a quick example. In the early days of our market centers, we had a regional director who shall remain nameless, who just nobody liked. And nobody liked him because he was a jerk. And he would walk around saying like rude and inappropriate things, like inappropriate from the perspective of like, why would you say that? Like not inappropriate the way we think inappropriate today, but just like, why can't you be kind? Why? And he would say things like, well, I'm a high D. What do you expect from me? Well, I expect you to be human. You can exhibit traits of a high D who are far more aggressive in their nature and still not be a jerk, right? Those two things are not necessarily connected. And so again, when you use natural behavioral style as an excuse for poor behavior, that's not so cool. Other than that, there really isn't a right or wrong version of behavior. Everyone just is what they are and has to adapt to certain circumstances or certain roles. Kimberly.
Yeah, that was going to be my point. I think we're all born with a certain type of behavior. And so if you take the disc, it shows, like for me, it says I'm high D, high C, right? So I'm very direct, very compliant, not really an extrovert, but when I was doing open houses, right? Or when I was working with a client who was an extrovert, really bubbly and out there, in order for her to feel comfortable, I realized I had to adapt my behavior and interaction with her. Because I'm really an introvert, but sometimes I have to adapt in this business to work with people who are extroverts. And I found myself like after an afternoon of open houses, being bubbly and open and all this other stuff, I would go home, be completely drained.
Yeah.
I had to kind of overcompensate. And that's something that you learn, if you're an introvert, but you have a client who's like, just bubbly and extroverted, you adapt. And to your point, neither is right or wrong. It's just understanding that there are 4 different type of people and understanding what type they are so that it helps you engage and interact with them to the best of your ability. And then, when you don't have to, then you can go back to being your normal self, which is what you're kind of born with.
Yeah, so true, right? No truer words were ever spoken. And I appreciate you sharing that because there is that reality of you have to adapt, right? You can't expect other people to adapt to you, especially when you're in a sales role, right? You need to recognize, and so the important part of what Kimberly just said is you first have to know you, which is why I'm going to give you the link to the assessment at the end of our time together, right? So you can go and just take the assessment, you'll get the report back, or I'll get the report back, and unless it says something that I am really disappointed in, and I send you to Coldwell Banker, I'll forward it on to you so that you can read it. And then if you want to have a conversation around kind of what it says and what it looks like, I'm happy to do that. But understanding you first so that you know where you naturally stand, right? Like, and it's funny because the other thing that Kimberly said is that is so really important, is that you can succeed doing things that are outside of your natural behavioral styles. Like Kimberly, I'm a high D, high C. Knew there was a reason I loved that girl. And so that's not necessarily a natural sales style, because neither Kimberly nor I have naturally great people skills, right? That we have to work that muscle. We have to work to want to kind of have a chat, or, neither of us is really good at small talk, right? And so all those kinds of things where you fall into those categories of like a high D, a high C, the I and the S are the relational behaviors. And yet neither one of us doesn't not succeed in real estate because of it, right? We just recognize that we have to work a little bit harder. And as Kimberly said, sometimes when you have to work harder at pushing a part of yourself that doesn't come naturally to you, it's draining. It can be exhausting, right? And so managing your energy then, knowing that you might have to pull something up or pull something down in terms of these styles is really helpful to know. All right, so let's just kind of flip around the chart real quick and give you a picture of what each of these styles looks like. And then we'll talk about how you use this information. I'll also give you some percentages of what part of the population kind of falls into each of these categories. That's always a fun aha for everyone. Let's start in your upper left-hand corner with the high D, right? We're going to do D, I, then S, then C. So we'll just do it in the disc order. So that high D, if you notice, it describes that person as dominant, right? Their main goal every morning when they wake up is to get up and conquer something. Like, I'm going to go and conquer. Ugh. And some D words, right? Some D words, it says keywords underneath there. Some D words that may help you remember the high D would be dominant or direct. Aggressive might be a word. It's not necessarily a D word, but aggressive might be another word, right? People, like, bottom line it for me, people, right? Those kinds, some of you might call them type A, right? All those things kind of describe that high D. I can't remember what movie it's from. Someone, when I say it, you might remember the movie, and please share it with us. There's a movie where someone calls someone else a dictator. And the other person in the room says, well, that seems kind of harsh. And the person who says it says, hence the tater. Get it? Because they added the tater to the dictator to not quite be as harsh. I can't remember what movie that's from. I'll figure it out. But so that high D wakes up every morning looking for something to conquer, direct, dominant, aggressive. The key emotion for a high D, is that high Ds are quick to anger. So they have that kind of flash emotion, right? High Ds typically have to remember to take a breath when confronted with something new, take a breath and think about a response, or else you typically get a reaction, right? Because it's that flash, it's that quick to anger emotion that pops out in the high D. They are motivated by challenge. Again, they wake up to conquer something every morning. So it's like, what's the challenge? What are you going to throw at me today? Don't tell me I can't do that, because I will prove you wrong. And they're motivated by the bottom line. Now you can hear that either way. You can hear it from the perspective of communication, right? Like, bottom line it for me. Some of you know, some of you have been to classes of mine or to larger group conversations where I'll set the stage. I say, okay, so we want as many questions as you have. However, please leave out the backstory. Like get to the point. Like, what is the question? I don't want 45 minutes of, I was born in Columbus, Ohio, and did all this stuff, and finally we get to the question. Let's just get to the question. Bottom line it for me. Give me the facts I need to solve the problem. Or you can hear that from the other side of things, because most high Ds are kind of bottom line oriented people, in that financially bottom line, like let's just get down to it, right? Talk to me about the bottom line. The mantra or the motto for a high D is, I will do it. I will do it. Right? Sometimes high D personalities, high D behavioral styles, they struggle in that first leverage moment in their world, right? And what I mean by that is when it comes time to hire somebody, there's a struggle point there, because their motto, their whole existence is, I'll do it. No one does it better than me. I don't have the time or the desire to teach someone else how to do it better than me, so I'll just do it myself. Right, and I can see some of you smiling and nodding your heads, because you're hearing yourselves in some of these descriptions. And by the time we get to the end of each of the four, you'll hear yourself in at least one or two of what I'm describing, right? And it's important to remember that each of us is comprised of each of these four behavioral styles. Some of us just have some dominance in one or two versus others. The fears of a high D. The fears of a high D. And I will tell you again, as one of these behavioral styles, this was, when I learned this, it was life-changing for me. Truly life-changing for me. I'll tell you why in a second. The fears of a high D behavioral style are being taken advantage of and wasting time. Now notice, it doesn't say the high D dislikes those things. They're described as fears, almost irrationally so, right? There's almost that level of, I dislike wasting time so much that it becomes like this thing in my body where I fear it, so I don't want to dive into it. I don't want to ever go there. I don't want to talk about even going there, right? Because that's a waste of time. And I'll tell you, when I learned that about myself, that one of my fears naturally was being taken advantage of, it showed me so clearly why I reacted to things the way I reacted to them. Because my reaction was from that point of, I'm going to use a word and then I'm going to quickly backpedal on the word, because I don't mean it the way that it'll come across. It's almost like a small level of paranoia, right? It's not to that extreme, but there is that little thing in like the back of a high D's head saying, okay, what's your ulterior motive? All right, I'm going to outthink you on this because I like to win. So I'm going to outthink you on this. And so if you've said this to me, is that just real? Should I take you at your word? Do you see all the overthinking that goes into that? And yet it is a natural response for that high D personality. Are you starting to get a picture of that high D? Either unmute and let me know, or type in the chat box, whichever is simplest for you. What industries or roles, jobs, occupations do you think you find a lot of high Ds in?
Finance?
So yeah, like the high rolling world of finance, right? The stockbrokers, the attorneys. Yeah, I love attorneys are oftentimes high Ds. CEOs, right? High D personalities. Anything else? Right, sometimes doctors, Kimberly put down surgeons, right? So people who need to achieve at a high level to reach where they are, right? Because high Ds typically have that claw their way to the top mentality. All right, let's move from the high D to the high I. The high D to the high I. The high I is described as the influencer. They wake up every single morning looking to persuade someone to their way of thinking, or to persuade someone to do something that's fun, or to persuade someone to jump on the bandwagon, right? They're the life of the party people. They're the, come on, don't be such a stick in the mud, let's have fun people, right? Some words that describe the high I, besides influential and persuasive: effusive, bubbly, right? Effervescent. I like to think of the high I as the chatty Cathys of the room, right? Because high I's typically talk a lot, because they just can't help themselves. They're high energy people, and they're people, right? The main difference between a high D and a high I, whereas the high D might kind of want to be left alone to do their own thing, like the high I, like the second they're alone, they're missing other people, right? They have to turn the radio on, or turn the TV on, or call someone, or, right? Because they're relationship people. They need people around them to feed them energy. The key emotion for the high I, optimism. High I's are the eternal optimists. High I's are motivated by two things: flattery and recognition. High I's like to be told they're doing a good job. High I's like to be recognized for the things that they do. Right? So your team leaders are both high I, high D personalities. Now that differs from me in that I'm a high D, high C personality. So I don't kind of get the I thing of needing that recognition, or the pat on the back, or the attaboy thing. I don't get that. I don't crave it. I don't seek it out. I don't need it to survive or achieve. And yet your team leaders, from that place in them that is that high I, they do look for that. And as the person they report to, I have to remember that. I have to remember that more people in my world look for that than don't look for that. Right? I have to remember that a lot of you look for that, because I'm not good at that. I'm not good at the hey, great job, attaboy, you know, excellent job type. I'm just not good at it, because I forget that people need that, right? So I have little notes, I have reminders. I have to remind myself as a coach to anyone who is the high I, that every step of the way, I need to make sure that they know they're doing a great job, and recognize their victories and help them celebrate those victories. Or else they feel unfulfilled at a place that they crave fulfillment. You see how that starts to work, and how understanding you and the people around you starts to go together? I'll give you some more examples of that as we keep going. The high I's motto or mantra is, you can do it. Not from the perspective of, I don't want to do it, but like from a cheerleader perspective, right? Because they are the cheerleaders. Go, 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 woohoo! You're the best. I'm the best. We're all the best together. Right? And the high I fears rejection. High I's fear rejection. Now, with a high I fearing rejection, what one activity that we know creates success in a sales-based industry might they struggle with if they fear rejection?
Making calls.
Yeah, lead generation, right? So lead generation can be a struggle for the high I, because innately in their belly, they just have this terrible fear of calling someone and being rejected, right? For other behavioral styles, that's less of an issue. And so they still may have to figure out, the high C likes to be prepared. So they may have to have a whole lot of scripts ready and practiced before they move forward with lead generation. And yet the high I, if I've just described you, part of your struggle, at least a potential part of your struggle, could be outreach to people you don't know, or even you do know, because you fear that rejection, right? So, and once you start to understand that about yourself, you start to say, okay, well, how can I build a plan or a strategy around that or through that, so that I can do what I have to do and not get stuck with that fear, right? And we'll talk about that in a minute. You're starting to see the picture of the high I. You're starting to see the difference between the I and the D. Now, if you'll notice, the I and the D on your page are both at the top of your page. And so across the top, right here, between the D and the I want you to write these two words, because these two words describe both the I and the D. That's fast and aggressive. Both the I and the D, from a pacing perspective, they're fast. They typically talk fast, they move fast, they think fast, they act fast, and they expect people around them to do the same, right? And they are more aggressive. It's why they call it the leadership Z, right? Which would mean high D, slightly higher I, and then a lower S and a lower C. The leadership Z, a lot of leadership positions require that high D and the high I. The high D for achievement purposes, and the high I for follow me people purposes. Both fast and aggressive. However, with the differences we just discussed. All right, let's move to the S. So we did the D and the I. Let's move to the bottom part of the graph, and we'll talk about the S. If you'll note, the high S can be best described as steady. They wake up every morning trying to figure out how to be supportive. The high S is also a people person like the high I, but in a quieter way, in a more reserved way, in a way that says, how can I help? Right? The key words of a high S: steady, stable. They tend to be really good listeners, high S's. I like to call high S's the softer side of Sears, not because it has a lot of S's, but it reminds me of like those commercials in the late 80s or early 90s when Sears decided to change their image, right? Their image was tools, craftsmen, tools. And they wanted to appeal more to a feminine audience. And so they developed this whole ad campaign that said, come see the softer side of Sears. And all of a sudden it was about sheets and bath towels and, right? And some of you on this call who are female are saying, what the hell does sheets and bath towels have to do with me? But I'm just telling you what the ad campaign was, right? And so the idea of softening their image, that's kind of the high S, a softer image of the I version of a people person, right? The key emotion of the high S is an interesting one, because the key emotion for the high S is that the high S tends to hide their emotions, tends to not be too vocal or what's the visual form of being vocal? I can't think of the word.
Extrovert?
Yeah, we'll go with that. It wasn't what I was thinking of, but we'll go with that, right? And so they kind of push that down a little bit, right? My grandmother is a DS personality, right? And so the S side of her is always about, like, you know, nothing's wrong. Nothing's wrong. Even if there's something wrong, well, nothing's wrong, because we're just going to hide that emotion, right? Because perhaps if I do that, it'll help everyone else just be calm, and we'll overlook it, and we'll all just kind of move forward and smile, right? It's like being at Disney World, right? There's no crying at Disney World. I'm still convinced that Disney, one of Disney's genius moves, was they have built an entire system where the second someone starts to be sad or cries when you're in one of their parks, the ground opens up and you kind of fall through, and it closes up real quickly. And there's padding underneath so no one gets hurt. But there are people who rush over to them and say, oh, okay, there's no crying here. So let's give you a lollipop and put a smile on your face, and we're gonna go up the stairs over here and get you back to your parents. But no crying, because it's Disney World, everyone's happy here. The high S is motivated by benefits. And again, interestingly enough, that the high S is motivated by benefits for others. It's not really about benefits for themselves, because they're more about other people than they are for themselves. The motto or mantra for the high S: now that I understand or see what you're talking about or see what you're saying, I'll help you do it. Right? It comes from that spot of I'll help you do it. I'll help you achieve. Another S word that might describe the high S: service oriented, right? Because they are typically service oriented. The high S fears, their greatest fear. This is an important one, especially when I come to the percentages of the population that make up each of these four behavioral styles. The high S fears change. The high S fears change. And again, remember we talked about it, it's not just a dislike. We talk about it as a fear because there is some version of irrationality to that fear, right? They fear it to a level that says, oh, man, you know, I think I'd rather stay stuck in a bad situation than make a change. That's the level that they push back against change. Can you see that if you have a seller or a buyer who's a high S, that you might have a struggle helping them actually pull the trigger and get the job done? Because they're rooted in, let's just keep things the same. And what we do for a living is assist people through one of the most tumultuous times in their life, right? Birth, death, divorce, and buying and selling houses. Those are five of some of the most tumultuous times that you'll experience, or that one might experience. And so knowing that we're in the middle of that, if you have a real high S who really fears change, and you're struggling to get that price reduction with them as a seller, it may not be that you're thinking, well, I don't understand what you don't understand. The house isn't selling, we have to reduce the price. They get it. S doesn't stand for stupid, right? It stands for smart. They know, they understand the facts. Emotionally, though, they're stuck in that spot of, I just fear the change. And so it starts to affect the way they make decisions, because they'd rather just stay put than put themselves through the tumult of a change. Make sense? So the I and the S, if you'll notice on your sheet, the I and the S also share a line between them, right? And so along if you're looking at your sheet to the right-hand side of your sheet, between the I and the S, I want you to write two words as well. And that's relationship / people oriented. Because the I's and the S's, they are the people. They're different, and yet they're still the relationship-based people. People give I's and S's energy. All right, let's dive into the C, and then we'll finish the lines between the S and the C and the C and the D. So the high C personality. You see, it's described as someone who is compliant, right? These are your rules, people, right? If you ever go to someone's house for like a game night and you're opening a new game and somebody played it once before and you have a high C at the table, it is likely the high C will say, well, where are the instructions? We need to read the instructions, right? The high C may also be upset if we've played Monopoly a very specific way in my family for a very long time, right? And when we had a game night in one of the market centers one night, and I was part of the Monopoly thing because I love Monopoly and I like to win at Monopoly and I'm good at Monopoly. So I was part of the Monopoly crowd. And we're going through like the rules up front, and someone said, well, we're not going to play with anybody's family rules or anything, because I thought, well, wait, what do you mean? When you land on free parking, you get the money in the middle. No, you don't. That's not in the rules. I'm like, well, wait, what? Right, so there was a struggle because someone wanted to play by the game's rules. And I was, even though I'm a rules guy, I'm like, okay, but for 50 years, I've been playing Monopoly. Well, I wasn't playing Monopoly for 50 years, but I've probably been playing Monopoly for 40 years, right? For 40 years, I've been playing Monopoly where all the money goes in the middle when you land on free parking. And I like that because then I can buy hotels on my stuff when I land on free parking. How else do you get big payrolls of money? Anyhow, you can see that the high C also is noted to wake up every morning looking to avoid conflict. Right? Looking to avoid conflict. They're compliant and look to avoid conflict. Some words that describe the high C, other than compliant and perhaps conflict averse, are accurate, detail oriented. I find that I call the high C the charts and the graphs people, right? I never met a high C who didn't love Excel. There's nothing an Excel spreadsheet can't solve, right? It's like, okay, hold on, I have to take notes. Why are you opening Excel? I'm like, well, why wouldn't I open Excel? What do you take notes in? Well, how about notes? I'm like, no, there's no lines. It's not organized. You can't run formulas on it. Like, why would you do it in notes? Right? But you see how people think differently, and that high C personality, that high C behavioral style gravitates towards something like Excel because it makes sense for their brain. Am I right, Kimberly?
Yeah. So another example of that. So yesterday I dropped my daughter off at college, and so of course she had purchased all these things online that had to be put together, right? So there's like a shoe rack, right? So she opens it. She's like, oh, it's not put together. I'm like, well, it would have been a really larger box if you had done that. So it had 40 little connection pieces. It had the short tubes, the long tubes. And she's just like, oh, okay. She just started opening stuff. I said, wait, stop. Where are the instructions? And she's like, what do you mean? I said, and I pulled it out. This is how we figure it out. Because she was ready to start, putting this piece to this piece because it looked like it on the picture. I was like, whoa, stop. Here are the instructions. And she's like, okay. So that was my task. I did the shoe rack, set up the printer. It was all, that was my area. Meanwhile, and I looked at her, I was like, okay, you're not a C. She's the I to my D and C. But it's just like knowing that, if you have a person who's like, no, where are the instructions? What are the steps in buying a home? Now you're dealing with a C person, right?
Yeah.
If they want to know what comes next, because they don't like surprises.
Right. Great examples. And while Kimberly was putting the furniture together, Amber was decorating the room. talking to her new roommates and trying to figure out where they were going to go for dinner that night.
Yes, and taking TikToks of the room and the lights that she was putting up. And making her bed and the throws just right. That's exactly what she was doing. Completely. I mean,
right, because that's what a high I would focus on, right? It's the personal, it's the fun stuff, it's the right. And so you start to see these things show up in really concrete ways, right? Which makes it kind of fun and infuriating all at the same time, right? Okay, so the mantra of a high C, motivated by, the high C is motivated by correctness, being right. High C's like to be right. They like to be correct. Hence, Kimberly saying, whoa, wait a minute. Find the instructions. You can't just jam the dowel in the thing because you'll never get it out. And you have to, right? The motto or mantra for the high C, I will do it right no matter how long it takes. I will do it right no matter how long it takes. Right? And so you can start to see if you are kind of above the line, so strong in multiples of these, which is possible and typical actually, you can start to see how some of them start to conflict. I'll use myself as an example. As a high D, high C personality, right? There is an actual clinical term for that. Well, some people call it schizophrenia, right? Because the high D is oftentimes at odds with the high C. The high C says, I'll do it right no matter how long it takes. It's that perfectionist style of behavior. And the high D is over in the corner saying, what is taking you so long? Come on, go, go, go. I don't have time to waste. Move faster. And you're saying, okay, well, I'm doing it fast, but I have to do it right. But I have to do it fast, but I have to do it perfectly. Oh. And so when you start to understand those things about yourself, you then try to figure out ways, okay, what strategies do I use to help myself move forward? Because you can get stuck in that. And that's just a DC struggle point. There are struggle points between D's and S's. There are struggle points if you're a high IC, right? There are struggle points no matter which of your traits are overlapping. However, when they're kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum, like the D and the C, you really can end up feeling a little bit either stuck, frozen, schizophrenic. And yet when you learn about these styles, you say, okay, so I'm not schizophrenic. I just have two dominant styles that are sometimes at odds with one another. So I have to figure out a way, in this scenario, should I be bringing my high C to the table, or is this really a call for my high D? What am I trying to accomplish, and which one am I going to pull back on? I had a coach who one time said to me, he said, Rick, one of your problems is that you look for 100% in everything. And my response, I'm not kidding, what I said was, well, of course I do. I mean, why wouldn't you want 100? Like, I went right back to school, like test taking. Like, isn't the goal 100? I mean, I always looked for extra credit. Like, I wanted 105. Like, why are you saying that to me? And he said, no, that's not what I mean. He said, you're always looking for it to be just perfect at that 100% mark. The world doesn't work that way. Can we make a deal that you start using a strategy that says, if it's 80% what you want, maybe 85, you'll pull the trigger. And I have operated that way ever since, because it helps me not get stuck in the, it's not perfect, therefore we can't move forward. So I have to remember that whole conversation. Okay, it's not a 100% scenario. Is it 80 or 85? If it's there, well, then I have to decide to move forward and pull that C back down and push the D forward. So those are strategies that one can use in scenarios once you understand your own behavior better. Question was, what was the key emotion for the high C? Did I skip that? I think I did, didn't I? Fear. And unlike the, oh, sorry, I'm right. The high C, key emotions are fear, mostly fear of being wrong, right? It's not just general fear. It's that fear of doing it the wrong way and being risk averse. High Cs are not terribly risk averse, right? They like it to all make sense before they do anything. Again, motivated by correctness, mantra, I will do it right no matter how long it takes. And the fears, the biggest fear of the high C, criticism. Again, you can see that kind of goes hand in hand with wanting to be right, fearing being incorrect or inaccurate, right? They don't like criticism, right? High Cs, for those of you who hear yourself in that high C, one of the opportunities that exists for you is to find a strategy that allows you to hear criticism or hear feedback in a constructive way, right? Because we all know feedback is the breakfast of champions, and yet if your behavioral profile makes you push back on feedback because you hear feedback as criticism, well, that stunts your growth. It stops your ability to achieve from growing because you're not able to hear feedback. So you have to step back and start to think, okay, well, what if I just heard feedback for what it is? An external opinion about where I might be able to improve, instead of you're wrong, right? Because a lot of times high Cs hear feedback as criticism. Got a picture of the high C? Okay, so let's draw that line, or let's write underneath that line between the S and the C. These are the two profiles that are the bottom, make up the bottom of your chart. Between the S and the C, I want you to write slow and passive. Right? If you look at the top between D and I, we had fast and aggressive. Well, between the D and the C, these are your slower and more passive behavioral styles. And then between the D and the C, where we had relationship / people orientation on the other side between the S's and the I's, the D's and the C's, they fall into a category of, they are task-oriented. They are task-oriented, right? So if you're a D/C or some combination on the DC side, you're more likely to wake up each morning figuring out how many houses you have to list that day to stay on track to hit your goals. If you're on the I or the S side, you wake up in the morning thinking, from a business perspective, thinking, who might I meet today that I could help by listing their home and bringing them closer to their goals, right? It's the same idea. One of you comes from a task perspective. It's like my to-do list. One of you comes at it from a people perspective. All right, let me give you the percentages. Starting with of all the profiles based on what you've heard and what you've experienced in your own life, of the human population, which of these do you think holds the most people? Which is the highest in terms of population?
I.
So the I love that, Catalina. Any other guesses?
I think S.
S?
My guess is D.
D. Anybody for C? Anybody want to go for C? Because then we'll cover them all. So
Sure, why not?
There we go. Steve will take that bet. So if we were betting, Ryan would win the pot, right? The highest number falls into the S category. 35% of the population tend to be S's, high S's. Now, again, I want you to remember what we talked about in terms of your clients and high S's, right? That means 3.5 times out of 10, you're going to be working with a high S behavioral style. And high S's fear change. And so from a business perspective, one of your challenges is to continue to figure out ways to have conversations, to be supportive and help people see the benefits, right? You see how we're putting all those words together? be supportive and help people see benefits to this move. Right? If Kimberly was my seller client who was a high S, I would constantly be talking her through where she's going, right? Because she's moving to, Georgia to be closer to family because her sister's having twins and needs help taking care of them because she's recently divorced. And so Kimberly's going to move down there to help her family out and get a great new job at wherever, at CNN, right? In Atlanta. And so I'm going to continue to focus Kimberly on, wow, it'll be so great to be closer to family, right? They're all down there. You're up here. It'll be so awesome. Tell me about the new job at CNN. What will you be doing? Are you excited, right? I'm going to continue to have those conversations with the high S seller that I have to help them remember why they're doing this, to not shut down. Number 2 would fall to a tie between Steve and Catalina. I's and C's both make up 30%. 30% of the population. So the high S, 35, the high I, 30, the high C, 30. Now for the mathematicians in the room, if you do some quick math, that leaves only a very small percentage of high D behavioral profiles. 5% of the planet operates from that high D behavioral style. Now, thank God, right? Because if there were more, we could be in big trouble. And yet I will tell you, for high Ds out there, when I learned that statistic, I'm telling you what, it changed my world. I thought to myself, oh, now I get it. I understand why I feel kind of alone, right? Because there's not a ton of people who are that much like me. Now, you happen to live inside of an industry, right, that high D and high I personalities tend to gravitate to. So there may be more high D personalities on this call. We may have more than 5% of this call who exhibit high D behavioral styles, behavioral traits. And just because you live in an industry that tends to attract high D personalities. But high S 35, I and C 30, high D 5%. Does that give you a picture of what all those styles kind of pushed together look like? You have questions, comments, or concerns about what we just went over? Did you see you in one or more of those behavioral styles? I know many of you did, because as I gave examples or as I said certain words, I could see you're laughing and you're putting your head down and thinking, oh, Christmas Eve, he's like so describing me, right? Some of you are sitting there thinking, oh, he is so describing my spouse. Oh, now I get it. Now I get it. And I'll tell you what's fascinating is understanding your own behavior absolutely then helps you understand others' behavior. And when you start to study this more and more and more, you can use this not just with buyers and sellers or with other agents. You use it with your spouse. You use it with your kids, right? You understand people at a different level and recognize that the person who you live with is not doing that just to push your buttons. Anybody ever feel that way? It's like, okay, really? Does he or she not know that that drives me insane? And it could just be that behaviorally that's natural to them and they don't have as much of an understanding about your natural behavioral style as you might have of theirs as you start to learn about behavior. And so you start to see things a little bit differently, right? When my son was growing up, if his bedtime was 9 o'clock and I would glance at the clock and it would be like 8:57 and I'd be like, okay, no, it's bedtime. he would stop very specifically and say, no, Daddy, I have 3 more minutes. Right? Because my son is a ragingly high C. He's very detail oriented, right? He was a by the clock kind of kid. If bedtime was 9 o'clock, don't tell me I have to go to bed at 8:57, because that's not what you told me. And as I learned more about his behavior, it helped me help him and I not have conflict. Because instead of saying, no, it's bedtime at 8:57, I would say something like, okay, Noah, 5-minute warning. It's 8:55, 5-minute warning till 9 o'clock. And that he was cool with, because it was correct. And he understood that, right? So it's fascinating how you can start to use these things in your life to create less drama and conflict in your world. Frankly, I would not have studied behavior as much as I have studied behavior in the last 15 years if it didn't reduce drama. Because someone at some point said, oh, you know what? The better you understand this, the less drama in your life. I'm like, okay, sign me up. Anybody else like a low drama type person? Because there's one thing I could do without pretty much every minute of every day is the drama. And so again, conflict only arises from unmet expectations. And so when you have expectations of someone in your world based on what's real for them and real for you in terms of behavioral style, you end up having far fewer conflicts because you understand where it's coming from, right? You understand where it's coming from. I live with someone who loves to post on social media. For those of you who know me for more than 10 minutes, you know that I never post on social media. Some of you know I do have an account, but I haven't touched it in 10 years. I think I have 400 people who have friend requested me who I haven't said yes to because I just don't touch it. I look at Facebook on Steve's account, but I don't engage in Facebook because my behavioral style says, you know what, I'd rather people not know. I'd rather just be over here by myself. But see, that human interaction, that connection, that feeds him. That gives him energy. It freaks me out. I don't like it. Right? But again, I used to think that we'd go out to eat and he'd take a picture of the food. Oh, look at that, and put it on social media and type a thing about it. And I'd be like, what are you doing? Like, I swear you're doing it just to annoy me. No, it's not. He's not doing it to annoy me. He's just doing it because that's what drives him, right? It makes him great at what he does. It makes him a great team leader, right? Because he creates relationships with people and can keep that relationship going at a far faster and higher level than I ever can. Right? I was a team leader for a while, and I wasn't not successful. I was not as successful as he or Dan are at it. But that was tons of effort and energy for me, right? People who experience me in a classroom setting are always surprised to hear that I'm really kind of a loner person who would rather be alone in a room without any people in it than be at a party. That is true about me. And yet what I know about myself is that in order to do my job well and show up for you guys the way I feel I need to show up for you guys, I have to pull some of that down and pump up some of my I and my S to make sure I don't come across as like this cold fish jerk. That takes more energy. A full day of teaching for me, I get home, I'm wiped. If instead I'm sitting in this room doing just paperwork and brokerage stuff and whatnot all day, I have far more energy when I get home because that's my wheelhouse, that's my comfort zone, right? And the cool thing is that you can succeed being outside of your comfort zone. You just have to manage the energy it takes to do that. Any other questions, comments, concerns, queries about what we just went through? So the rest of your package, and we'll leave you with this, the rest of your package gives you some other information about how to use what we just went through. For example, there's a page that says DISC, personality profiles, and it talks about how you would interact with a high D personality, right? So or with a high I personality. So working with the high I, you need to have the time be stimulating to that person. You need to save enough time to be social, yet keep it fast moving and get to business, right? If you know you have a high I across the table from you and you're not a high I and you skip the social part, you've missed an integral piece of connecting with that person. Because as a high I, they want some social time with you. They want to talk about the weekend. They want to talk about where you got your shoes. They want to talk about, you know, where you're taking your family on vacation or whatever. They want some social time. And so you have to help balance that when you know you're talking to a high I. Right? If you're talking to a high D, be careful and you take issue. If you disagree, you have to disagree with facts, not people, right? Because the high C and the high D, they take that personally. Don't tell me I'm wrong. Who are you to tell me I'm wrong? Then the high C will say, okay, well, if you're really going to tell me I'm wrong, I need you to prove it. I want 15 graphs showing me that you're right. I'll settle for 9, but no fewer than 9 different charts, right? If you're dealing with a high S, you need to make sure that you understand their motivation at a really deep level, right? Because the high S does everything from that place of inside of them, that heart place. So you need to really dive deep to understand what's motivating and keep that front and center. I'll tell you, for a high S, someone like me, if I don't make adjustments, comes across slick. And I learned that early on in my career. If I'm just me and I'm sitting across from a high S who's slower paced than I am and far more people oriented than I am, I come across way too fast and way too task oriented. So I have to learn how to slow down. I have to learn how to slow my speech down. God, it's hard to do that even on purpose for me. I have to learn to slow my speech down. I have to ask more questions. I have to make sure that the conversation is focused on them. All consultative strategies as well. But if I'm talking across the table from a high D or a high I can keep the speed going and not have that work to my disadvantage. The second I'm across from an S who's slower paced, or a C who's slower paced because they want backup, if I'm moving too quickly, again, I come across as slick and I might just get the X. Yeah, you know what? No, he was too slick. The converse is true as well. If you're a slower paced person, if you're a high S and you're slower in your mannerisms and in your speech, and you're talking to a high D or a high I, you've got to recognize that and you've got to learn how to pick up the pace. Because I will tell you, when people are telling me a story and they're telling it slowly, it is really hard for me to not like be tapping my foot or like, oh my God, when are we getting to like get to the question? What is the point? I don't need all this like mushy cushy stuff, right? And so if you're that high S or that high C who's a slower pace and you're across from a high D or an I seller, you may get the X as well, because the high D is now sitting there thinking, okay, I think this person is probably very smart, but I think I would put a bullet in my head after 2 weeks if I hired them to list my house. So that's how behavior shows up in your world. It's how it shows up in your ability to list and sell more property, is understanding you and understanding the people around you. So I'm going to give you, I thought I'd have it by now. I have a link. So let me see. Who is Galaxy Note 10 on the call? Can you just pop your actual name in the chat box? Any of you who have like iPhone or most of you have your names. I'm just not sure who Galaxy Note 10 is. I need you to pop your name in the chat box because I have an attendance roster. I will send you to each of your emails by this afternoon the link for the free disc. Never pay for a disc. We have unlimited discs available for you that we pay for at the Market Center level for the entire year. So you can take disc, you can use disc if you're hiring or whatnot. You can certainly use that. And so maybe Galaxy Note 10 is not on any longer. All right. Well, I'm sorry I don't know who you are, Galaxy Note 10, but I will send everyone else the link by the time I leave for dinner tonight. So watch for it. Do me a favor. If you choose to click the link and take the assessment, you need probably 15 or 20 minutes. It's not long. 15 or 20 minutes in a quiet space where it's just you, where you're not going to be disturbed by cell phone, emails, children, spouses. You need 20 minutes of solid just you time in a quiet space to answer the questions as completely as you can. And then those results will come to me and I'll pass them along to you. And again, if you want to just have a quick conversation around them once you receive them, I'm happy to do so.
Hey, Rick.
Yes, Janine.
Hello, by the way.
Hello.
Does it ever change if you took an assessment once upon a time and then you take it years later? Do your personality traits ever change and evolve?
So that's a great question, and it's part of why I don't love the word personality, right? And I know a lot of what I sent you says personality because in the old days, and a lot of these are from the old days, I haven't redone them. We called it personality. So behavior is far more rooted to you. It's more in your DNA than personality. Personality can and does change over time. Can your behavior change over time? The answer is this: yes. And yet it usually takes a major life event to push you in a direction where you literally start waking up different each day. And it doesn't usually happen overnight, right? And so you're not necessarily, the DISC assessment measures each of these four categories from 0 to 100, and the power line is called 50. Right? So anything over the power line, anything over 50% is what you're considered dominant in, right? And so what can happen is some of those lines can adjust a bit over time, where if you were like a sort of a ragingly high D and, life changes occurred to you that just kind of, maybe you got really ill. Right? I've seen this kind of thing happen. Someone who is like a real high driven person, a behavioral style, gets ill and almost dies and comes out of that whole experience with kind of an awakening saying, you know what? I get how I was wired before, and yet I am going to start slowing down and smelling the roses and appreciating the people in my world more. Over time, that particular person's level of D could come down on the assessment a bit. It's not all of a sudden going to be like below the line. If they were high before, they'll almost always be high. However, some ups and downs on the charts can show up after major life events. Does that help answer that, Janine?
Yeah, it's interesting because as I get older, I see different priorities within myself and how I'm approaching them. Or, in some cases, you and I talked about, like, as soon as I walked in your office, everyone was like, "You're a high D," and I'm like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." What are you talking about? Prove it. But now I just feel like I'm less high D in certain things and other, you know what I mean? So.
Yeah.
But whatever.
And that can be, right? Because here's the thing, the more awareness you bring to understanding your behavior allows you, it may not be, you'll get two scores when you take the assessment. You'll get the natural score and the adapted score. And what I find is that more times over time, the adapted score changes. The foundational stuff kind of remains the same, but you choose with the knowledge of your behavior, you choose to live life differently and prioritize different things. So you may show up to your day each day with slightly different styles, but a lot of that is not natural. It's adapted. Over time, the adaptedness can become more natural, is how I think I would describe it. Any other questions before we finish up? Got a full minute left. I'll say one more thing about changing over time. One of the reasons that I think that assessment results can change over time is that the first time you take the assessment, you're taking it cold. And it's probably the most accurate. If any of you have English as more of a second language than first, sometimes the test, the assessment, it's not a test, I'm sorry, I keep saying that. Sometimes the assessment is tougher and you get less accurate results because there's a vocabulary that if English is your second language and you're not strong in the vocabulary that the assessment uses in English, it can sometimes skew the results. Just PS. So if that affects anybody, just know that can sometimes happen. If you're completely bilingual and the vocabulary on the English side is not a problem for you, then your bilinguality itself is not of concern. It's just sometimes I find that when you don't have strong vocabulary on the English side, some of the words that are used in the assessment, if there's either not a translation or you're not sure what they mean, it can sometimes so you're guessing at some of those, and so you maybe skew the results. But what can happen is if you take the assessment multiple times, you know better what they're asking. And so sometimes if you have a desire to be less of one and more of another, you start to game the assessment a little bit, saying, oh, I'm pretty sure if I answer that, they're gonna like stamp me C. So I'm gonna answer this one because I'd love to be more of an I than a C. Or so again, sometimes not on purpose, but multiple times sometimes allows you to influence your own results. All right, guys, I hope that was helpful. Like I said, I will send the email out to each of you by later tonight so that you can take that assessment. And then once I receive the results, which are pretty instantaneous, by the way, I'll forward them on to you. And again, if you want to have a quick conversation about those results, just email me back and I'll be happy to do so. All right? Okay, so Tanya, stay on if you would, because I want to have just a quick conversation with you. Everybody else, thank you for being here. We'll see you later. If you're joining us at 1 o'clock for Ben Kinney, we'll start on time at 1. If not, we'll see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm coming back.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
What I am on the disc profile.
I'm sorry, ask me that again.
Can you guess what I am? On the disc profile. On the disc profile. Or maybe you don't know me that much.
Yeah, I was going to say it may be hard because our interactions have been limited.
Yeah. So I'm a high C and a high S.
Okay. Yep. So
but
what's
MD, but not a lot. Like get to the point. I need to have that. I have that. And somewhere in the middle of an I. Like I don't need to be the life of the party. You know? Ooh, no.
Yeah. So what'll be fun is have you taken the assessment?
I did, and Jen just sent another one last week, a totally different one, and so.
Yes, Jen's using the Abelson one now, rather than the Tony Robbins. I wasn't a fan of the Tony Robbins results, so
That's
Yeah,
where the seeing the ads from the Tony Robbins.
it'll be fun to see if the Abelson one confirms the SC. And yet, you know what? Again, you can succeed in anything with any style. It's just once you have awareness around how you operate and where your sweet spot is, then you can make adaptations to do whatever it is you need to do.
Oh yeah.
So I'm just going back and bringing up your
My question.
question. Here we
So
go.
I have a buyer. Well, he just sent me like this for sale by owner.
Yep.
And so I told him I would get back to him, but because I didn't know how to proceed with who pays me.
So the answer to that question,
Mhm.
the answer to that question is it depends. The
Okay.
first thing you should do is you should call the for sale by owner and say, hey, I have a client who is interested in your property.
Mhm.
I'm curious, are you protecting brokers?
Okay.
And if they say yes, you can say, great, at what percentage?
Okay.
Right? So some for sale by owners will pay a certain percentage if you bring the buyer.
Okay. That's what I read.
And then I'll send you a document that you can adjust. If that's the case, you can adjust this document and send that off to the for sale by owner to sign that they will in fact pay you, because we do need a written agreement of compensation if they're going to pay.
Okay.
If they say, no, I'm not protecting brokers, or if they say, what does that mean? If they say, what does that mean? It says, well, most for sale by owners are willing to pay a commission to the buyer's agent if we bring our clients to your property. Are you willing to do that, and at what number?
Okay.
If they say no, you can start with saying, are you sure? You're still saving the list side, and I have people who I think might be really good candidates for your house, or whatever. And so if they decide not to protect brokers and they will not pay, your buyer agreement is how you get paid, right? So your buyer will sign the buyer agreement, and in paragraph 7 of the buyer agreement, it outlines that the buyer is responsible for your fee. If nobody else steps up and pays it, like the seller or something through the MLS or whatnot, then they're responsible for your fee.
Okay. So I have to have a conversation with him about. Okay.
Correct. And then the buyer agreement says that we're due either 3% for something on the MLS or 5% for a for sale by owner or something off the MLS. Now you can certainly negotiate that number, and you can do a bunch of different things. If the seller is not willing to pay and you're looking for a full 5% because you end up doing work on both sides and the buyer is willing to pay that, then great. You sign the buyer agreement and we invoice the buyer at closing. If the buyer is willing to pay 2.5 and the seller is willing to pay 2.5, you can get paid from both sides. Or if the seller is willing to pay you 2.5 or 3%, and you're not going to look for anything else from the buyer, because you would make that 2.5 or 3% if you found them a house on the MLS anyway only, then you can just accept what's from the seller. You have kind of all the options on that in that conversation.
Okay. What if, because he's trying to buy before he sells his townhouse?
Yeah.
How would I discuss the amount if the for sale by owner said no? How would I?
Right. So the
Because he said once he finds a new house, because he's not in rush, of course, and then he can sell the townhouse. But I can list the townhouse, so I don't want to seem greedy.
well, to me it's not greed, right? There's your S popping out.
Okay.
It's not greed. It's you getting paid for the work that you're going to do.
Okay. All right.
You don't work for free. And so if you want my involvement in helping shuttle you through this for sale by owner transaction, this is what it costs. I will look to see if I can get it paid by the seller. If the seller is unwilling to pay, it will be paid by you. Now you can also have this conversation. So Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, if it's paid by you, we can do one of two things. We can either have you, I'll just invoice you, right? The brokerage will invoice you at the closing. And so you pay for the house and then you pay the brokerage fee separately. Or we can write the offer with my fee included. That way they get to finance, if they're financing it, they get to finance the funds. If they're paying cash, it doesn't matter. But if they're financing it, right? So if the house is on for 500 and the commission you're looking for is 3% of that, they could write the offer for 515. You just have to be clear with the seller saying, look, the offer is written for 515 and that includes 3% coming back to me for my fee. So what's left for you is 500. This way, when it goes to the mortgage company, the mortgage is written off of the higher number so they can finance most of that fee and not have to actually write you check out of pocket at closing.
Okay. Okay.
Does that help?
Yes, and I would have that discussion with the buyer.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, so certainly the first round of discussion, the first call is to the seller to see if they're protecting brokers. Hopefully they are, and then you get to go back to the buyer, who still needs to sign a buyer agreement, by the way, in order to have you show him the property. So he needs to sign a buyer agreement with a conversation that says, I called. The good news is that they're willing to show the house. The other good news is that they're willing to cover my fee. Sign here to hire me. And now we go see the property and we go into
Sign that. My exclusive right to represent?
the buyer.
Yeah.
The buyer signs the exclusive right to represent buyer form.
Signed that already.
Okay, good.
Yeah. We went out last week, Friday. And
Cool. So you're covered. Either way, you're covered, because when he signed that, what he said was, if I find something off the MLS, you get paid and I pay you.
Okay. Okay.
That's paragraph 7. I think it's 7C.
Okay.
You want to review that. 7B or C.
Okay.
Make sense? Does that help?
One question about the buyer's agreement. It's I think you said it's okay for them. We ran across a buyer. She only wanted to see this one property. Isn't it? That's still okay, right?
Yeah, you would do the same agreement with the same 3 or 4 month time period for just one property. Make them property specific if that's what you choose.
Oh, I probably did it wrong. So in the date where it says like today's date, and then it ends 3 months from now.
Yeah, you want to make sure that there's protection, that if you show that one property and they buy it, that you get paid.
Well, I'm glad I asked that because I did it wrong because I only did it for that day.
Yeah. And so what happens is then the next day they could go and buy the property. They don't have you don't have them. There's nothing tying you. So to me, the time period is always that 90 to 120 day period. However, we can do it just for one property. However, if you're going to buy this property in the next 90 days or 120 days, you're buying it through me.
Okay, I will see that. And then one more question.
Yeah.
Where did it just went out my head? Shoot, darn it. Oh, well, I don't remember now.
All right. Well, if you think of it, just
I'll email it to you. Thank you.
yeah, just email or text it to me. And the other thing I'll say is, if in fact the seller is protecting brokers, shoot me a quick text and say, I need that form, and I'll send you the for sale by owner Word document that you'll just take their name, the address, your name, the buyer's name, and you'll kind of fit them into this document. You'll see it's just you'll have to just replace some of the information in this simple form and then send it back to the seller to sign.
Okay, and it's 3%, right? You said?
It's whatever it is you choose. If the seller is protecting brokers, they'll probably tell you what they're willing to pay.
Okay.
That might be 2, it might be 2.5, it might be 3. You'll then have to decide if you're okay accepting that. If the seller says 2 and you really want 2.5 or 3, you'll have to upfront, before you show the buyer the property, let the buyer know that they're willing to protect us till 2, but that doesn't cover my fee. I really am looking for 3%. So if you want to buy this house through me, you'll need to cover the 1% difference. And we can do that either by you writing a check or we put it into the offer.
Okay. And I should have this when I call, and I should have that form before we go to see it. I should have all of this conversation before we step foot into that house. Okay.
Yeah, the conversation about whether they will, if they will, then get the form from me, get the form adjusted and send it to the seller. Once the seller signs it, then you can set the showing up.
Okay. And I remember the question now.
Okay, I thought you might.
I remember Jen saying that you were having one-on-ones with us and her coaching. Are you still doing that? Or that ship has
Yeah, no, I've been doing that for the last couple of weeks. You should have been receiving emails just to find a spot. Let me just make sure that you're on my email
You
list.
are. I get all your emails. I probably overlooked it.
Okay, yeah, so there were, I think yesterday or the day before, I released the ones STANCIL5 at Hotmail.
Yeah, that's me.
Okay, yeah, so you're on there. So if they're called business one-on-ones, I just sent one out yesterday. I think all those slots are gone already for the week because they go really quickly.
Of course.
I had 2 weeks of sending it only to the ALC and productivity coaching clients. So unfortunately, you missed that opportunity. But now each week I release it to the whole market center. So watch for them. I will be doing more next week.
Okay, thank you.
You're
So
welcome. All righty. Well, it's good to see you. I'm going to eat my chicken now.
let's go before 1 o'clock. Bye.
Yeah.